So it's the first time I've ever done this, not spoken. First time I've ever said, we're going to watch something on here, and then I'm going to make some points about it. So we're going to have a little resume of the book of Judges, which is done far better than I could ever do. So a few minutes of this. Thank you.
The book of Judges. So remember, after Joshua led the tribes of Israel into the promised land, he called them to be faithful to their covenant with God by obeying the commands of the Torah. And if they do this, they will show all the other nations what God is like. So Judges begins with the death of Joshua and basically tells the story of Israel's total failure. The book's name comes from the type of leaders Israel had in this period. Before they had any kings, the tribes were all governed by these judges. Now, don't think of a courtroom. These were regional, political, military leaders, more like a tribal chieftain. And you need to be warned, the book of Judges is very disturbing and violent. It tells the tragic tale of Israel's moral corruption, of its bad leadership, and basically how they become no different than the Canaanites. But this sad story is also meant to generate hope for the future. And you can see this in how the book's designed. There's a large introduction that sets the stage for Israel's failure as they don't drive out the remaining Canaanites. Then the large main section of the book has stories about the growing corruption of Israel's judges. And the progression here shows how Israel's leaders go from pretty good to okay to bad to worse. The concluding section is really disturbing and shows the corruption of the people of Israel as a whole. So let's dive in and we can explore each part a bit more. The opening section begins with the tribes of Israel in their territories in the Promised Land. And while Joshua defeated some key Canaanite towns, there was still a lot of land to be taken and lots of Canaanites living in those areas. And so chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups and towns that Israel just failed to drive out from the land. Now, remember, the whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshiping the gods through child sacrifice. God had called Israel to be a holy people, and that does not happen. Chapter 2 describes how Israel just moved in alongside the Canaanites and adopted all their cultural and religious practices. And it's right here that the story stops. For nearly a whole chapter, the narrator gives us an overview of everything that's about to happen in the body of the book. This part of Israel's history, the narrator says, was a series of cycles moving in a downward spiral. So Israel became like the Canaanites, and so they would sin against God. So God would allow them to be conquered and oppressed by the Canaanites, and eventually the Israelites would see the error of their ways and repent. So God would raise up a deliverer, a judge from among Israel who would defeat the enemy and bring about an era of peace. But eventually Israel would sin again, and it would all start over. This cycle provides the literary design and flow for the next main section of the book. It gets repeated for each of the 6 main judges whose stories are told here. Now, the stories of the first 3 judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Deborah, they are epic adventures. They're also extremely bloody stories. Either the judge themselves or people who help the judge, they defeat their enemies and deliver the people of Israel. The stories about the next 3 judges are longer, and they focus in on the character flaws of the judges, which get increasingly worse. So Gideon, he begins pretty well. He's a coward of a man, but he eventually comes to trust that God can save Israel through him. And so he defeats a huge army of Midianites with only 300 men carrying torches and clay pots. But Gideon has a nasty temper, and he murders a bunch of fellow Israelites for not helping him in his battle. And then it all goes downhill from there. He makes an idol from the gold that he won in his battles. And then after he dies, all Israel worships the idol as a god, and the cycle begins again. The next main judge is Jephthah, who's something of a mafia thug living up in the hills. And when things get really bad for Israel, the elders come to him begging for his help. And Jephthah was a very effective leader. He won lots of battles against the Ammonites, but he was so unfamiliar with the God of Israel, he treats him like a Canaanite god. He vows to sacrifice his daughter if he wins the battle. This tragic story, it shows just how far Israel has fallen. They no longer know the character of their own God, which leads to murder and to false worship. The last judge, Samson, is by far the worst. His life began full of promise, but he has no regard for the God of Israel. He was promiscuous, violent, and arrogant. He did win brutally strategic victories over the Philistines, but only at the expense of his own integrity, and his life ends in a violent rush of mass murder. Now, a quick note here. You'll notice a repeated theme in the main section of the book, that at key moments, God's Spirit will empower each of these judges to accomplish these great acts of deliverance. Now, the fact that God uses these really screwed up people doesn't mean he endorses all or even any of their decisions. God is committed first and foremost to saving his people, but all he has to work with is these corrupt leaders. And so work with them he does. This whole section is designed to show just how bad things have gotten. You can't even tell the Israelites and the Canaanites apart anymore, and that's just the leaders. The final section shows Israel as a whole hitting bottom. There are two tragic stories here, and they are not for the faint of heart. They're structured by this key line that gets repeated 4 times at the close of the book. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The first story is about an Israelite named Micah who builds a private temple to an idol, and that gets plundered by a private army sent from the tribe of Dan. So they come and they steal everything, and then they go and burn down the peaceful city of Laish and murder all of its inhabitants. It's a horrifying story. When Israel forgets its God, might makes right. The final story of the book is even worse. It's a shocking tale of sexual abuse and violence, which all leads to Israel's first civil war. It's very disturbing. And that's the point. These stories are meant to serve as a warning. Israel's descent into self-destruction is the result of turning away from the God who loves them and saved them out of slavery in Egypt. And now Israel needs to be delivered again from themselves. The only glimmer of hope in this story is found in this repeated line in the last part of the book. It actually forms the last sentence of the story. Israel has no king. And so the stage is set for the following books to tell the origins of King David's family, the book of Ruth, and also the origins of kingship itself in Israel, the book of 1 Samuel. But the story of Judges has value as a tragedy. It's a sobering explanation of the human condition, and ultimately it points out the need for God's grace to send a king who will rescue his people. And that's the book of Judges.
I must warn you, I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning and couldn't get back to sleep. So if I see anybody going to sleep in here, I should be very envious and perhaps even angry. Right, 5 points to do with the book of Judges. Number 1, in Hebrews 11 in the New Testament, there's a list of heroes of faith. In this list are Samson and some of the other judges. Find that confusing? The Bible Project overview we've just seen says Samson was the worst of the judges and had no knowledge of God or time for him. Now it's like that with the whole gamut of commentaries on this book. You get a whole, so many different people treating it in so many different ways and treating the judges in so many different ways. In some, like for example, I remember when I was a boy about Samson commended for his faith and leadership. Go get the lions and tigers, Samson. Go get the Philistines. God is with you. In others, they're mocked and pilloried for the sort of lives they were living, and all stages in between, in books and online stuff about this book. In between the two, it says God didn't have a lot to work with to save the Israelites, as time after time they went their own way, repented, then repeated the same cycle over and over. Also in between says you don't have to be perfect to open your life to the power of God, to transform you and those you're helping to change. If we think of Peter, how on earth, having just read Acts before we read Judges, how on earth God, could you use Peter? Jesus, your son, on the way to the cross. And Peter says, I don't know him, 3 times. And then the Acts of the Apostles. And the leader among the apostles there, really, Peter, moving in the power of God, healing people and leading the fledgling church. And here's somebody who was by no means perfect. Okay, character is important as we see the teaching about the gifts of the Spirit and the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, meekness, temperance, and faith. But we don't arrive overnight, and the fruit takes time to mature. We've just moved house. We live in a palace called Blenheim now. Actually, the house we live in is called Blenheim. We want to change it, but it takes so much time to tell people we've already changed address. It takes so much effort. Perhaps we'll leave it at Blenheim. What I've also discovered is that Blenheim is the name of an apple tree, an apple. There is a Blenheim apple. They are all over the place. And as you pick them up, it looks so wonderful until you turn it over and it's half rotten. Now, some of us here this morning will look at our own lives and we'll be on the negative side as we look. Others of us will look upon ourselves thinking we are God's gift to mankind and not a blemish there at all. And all stages in between. But we don't arrive overnight in terms of character, in terms of change to the sort of people we are as Christians. It takes time for fruit to mature. Meanwhile, open your life to the power of God's Spirit, as some of these people did. As the book of Acts advises us to do, for the first time, or maybe the umpteenth time, you don't have to be perfect for God to use you. Which is just as well, really, as I look at my own life. If God had to wait for a sinless day, there would be no hope for me. How about yours? Point 2 of 5, for anybody looking or anybody falling asleep. Part 2, one part of the tragedy of the book of Judges, as we've just seen, is the last few chapters. Civil war among the Israelites, and God's heart must have been broken once again. How about we Christians? Sometimes we've spent more time and energy contending with other Christian groups, churches, or individuals, sometimes dismissive, showing how right we are. And this has been going on, if not by us ourselves, for 2,000 years. Even Paul and Barnabas were not immune from this. When God wants us opening our lives to his Spirit to contend with his enemy, the devil, whose job it is to stop the world knowing Jesus Christ. How about praying for all those churches, locally or even globally, you've fallen out with, or don't really count as churches? How about praying for all those Christians down the years that you've fallen out with? And the 2 fingers point very much back to me, as well as anybody perhaps sitting here this morning. Civil war breaks God's heart. Point 3, God's justice and judgment. I don't find it easy talking about God's judgment, but both the Israelites and their enemies tasted it in the book of Judges. God of love? Yes. God's love is at the heart of his justice. Every human being on planet Earth is a creation of his, created by him and for him, to have a relationship with him, to follow him, helping to change the world with him. It's not for a tiny minority, which it can feel like in our society at the moment. The whole world, every human being who has ever lived, responsible for a response to God, their creator. As I said, we've just moved house. A load of new neighbours. Is it really more important they come to know Jesus Christ, or they support Bristol City, or Somerset Cricket, or clean up after their dog? Get praying. Help, Lord. I've known so many people who've been really nice, but never gave you a fingerhold in their lives and died like that. How about them, Lord? Your justice with a heart of love at the core, a difficult one, that. Part 4, idols. Can be spelt, as I used to be a teacher, it could be spelt 2 different ways, idols. Got a new car last December, and on the dashboard it says, whenever I make a mistake, it tells me what I've done wrong. And it's usually people in my family who are telling me what I've done wrong driving. But now it's the car. And one of the chief ones, I may have said this to you a lot before, I don't know. One of the chief ones is you stop at a traffic light and it says idling stop unavailable. I'm at a traffic light, I'm supposed to be stopping. Idling stop unavailable, but not that sort of idle, I-D-L-E. This is an I-D-O-L. And the book of Judges is full of how wrong it is to disobey the first commandment, which is God has given not just to his people, but he's given to the whole world. And that commandment is not to put anything before worshipping God. A substitute for God worship. For the Canaanites, child sacrifice to false gods. For the Israelites, yes, we live here now, so we'll copy them. For us, it's more and more, as I said just now, it's just, we live in such a secular society compared with all this. We live here now, so we'll copy them. What is an idol? Tim Keller says an idol is anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. And anything that you seek to give you what only God can give. In the first service this morning, we looked very, very briefly at Bible study tools online. And she goes through on there 10 possible idols in our society. Now, slightly younger average age in this congregation. So we're going to deal with somebody's different list. And thankfully, there's only 6 of idols on that list. We tend to think of idolatry. This is Jeffrey Curtis Poor. And Poor must be his surname, I think. If you go online, we tend to think of idolatry as a sin of the past or an Eastern mysticism thing. We certainly don't have idols in Western culture, or do we? Actually, idolatry is surprisingly modern and very prevalent in our culture. Part of the reason we don't think about idol worship today is because our definition of idolatry is off. We think idolatry is confined to bowing down to a golden statue or praying to a wooden trinket. And since we don't do that, we assume that we don't have idols. But we do have idols today, lots of them. They look different than the idols of the past, but we still practice idol worship today. And then he chooses that definition that I've just read out from Tim, so it must be a very good definition of idol worship. Anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything that you seek to give you what only God can give. Before you go into this, hear me, he says. I'm not saying we should rid ourselves of the things on this list. And this is different. These sort of idols in our secular society are different because they're stuff in the wrong place that in itself often is good and God-given. We mentioned her list that I mentioned in the first service this morning. One of the 10 idols was food. And she says, Why on earth, God, did you give us 10,000 taste buds to taste foods? Why not just the one? It would be so boring eating and a lot easier not to put food in the place of God. And it's so much so with so many of these. Quickly, through these, what did I say? 6. Number 1, our identity. It's easy to place our identity in something or someone other than God's. Whether it be our social media following, our position at work, our abilities, skills, or the achievements we're after. Many have their identity wrapped up in the wrong thing. Not only is this an idol, it's a tough way to live. If your identity is in your work, your skills, your looks, or anything else, you will constantly feel like you don't measure up. They're harsh masters. But when our identity is secured in God, we can live in freedom. While we will still fall short, God's love will never fail us. For some, their identity has become an idol. They have placed more value on who they are rather than in God's. Number 2, money/consumerism. In this context, it doesn't matter if you have money or you're broke. The pursuit of money and the acquisition of things. I looked in our loft last night. The pursuit of money and the acquisition of things is an idol for many in our culture. Many people trust their money more than they trust God's. Hear me on this, he says. Money is not bad. Money is a tool. And like any tool, you have to use it in the correct way, otherwise it can cause much damage. Money isn't the problem, it's how we use it and view it that can become a problem. Many have placed their hopes and dreams in money. They trust it to provide for them, care for them, and protect them. The problem is it can't live up to what we're trying to get from it. Money has become an ultimate thing for many of us. If the motivating factor in your life is money and not God, then that's an idol. Number 3, entertainment. Bristol City against Coventry last Wednesday night on Sky. Fantastic. I'm getting excited about this new football season. Sorry, I may have mentioned football to you before, but it's so exciting. Bristol City at home. Was it to Coventry? I can't even remember. No, it was somebody else. Anyway, it was 0-0 at 90 minutes. And after injury time, 0-0, Bristol City playing at home. The most boring thing in the world. We're obsessed with being entertained, and it comes in many forms, from Netflix to vacations, video games, podcasts. We love entertainment in all its forms. Again, as with the other idols list, it's not that entertainment is bad. It can be a good thing. And God loves and has provided loads of it. But when our lives become all about the search for entertainment and chase of the best experiences we can find, then it's become an idol. It's become more important than God's. I would argue, he says, that entertainment is good and a gift from God, but we should worship the giver, not the gift. Number 4, at last. We couldn't do this in the first service for obvious reasons. I was the average age there. This one's got 3 letters, and I'm not even going to say what the word is. We are obsessed with, in our culture, it's everywhere. It might be the only thing we think about more than money. We have taken a gift from God and made it into the God of our lives. And for many, their lives are controlled by that 3-letter words. To even question the 3-letter words, "Ewell" ethic in our society will bring a slew of accusations, showing how tied to our idol we actually are. Our sexual identity, and I've done it now, sexual practices and sex lives can be sacred to us. The church, he says, has some blame for this. Rather than portraying sex as a good gift from God in its place, instead they have in recent history heaped guilt and shame, which you could argue is one of the factors that brought this over-exaggeration of sex. But regardless of how we got here, for many today, sex is an idol. We value it more than we do God's. Nearly there now. Number 5, comfort. There's an endless list of products promising to simplify and add comfort to your life. Number 1, get married. No, it doesn't say that. We have made our lives much easier and much more comfortable than any other time in history. Tasks that used to take all day can be done in minutes. Many menial tasks are now automated. While that's a good thing, our pursuit in life should not be comfort alone. Jesus tells a very different narrative for his followers. He says that his followers will face trials, persecution, and difficulty. While comfort isn't bad, it can become damaging when it becomes the main pursuit in life. When comfort is an idol, we will struggle when God calls us to something difficult. Number 6, our phones. Smartphone addiction. I don't know if this is still true. I'm not very up with what's the latest, but this is about 4 years old he wrote this. Smartphone addiction is increasingly becoming a very worrying trend. This is especially true for Gen Z and millennial generations. I've seen him on his phone, that's why I picked on him now. This is especially true for Gen Z and millennial generations. But it's certainly not confined to them. For many, they simply cannot live without their phones or online presence. This is quickly becoming an idol for many. The problem isn't our phones or social media or any form of technology. It's the value we place on it that makes it a problem. When our lives revolve around how many likes we get, what our following looks like, or if we can't sit in silence for 5 minutes without refreshing our newsfeed, we might have an idol. Anything that takes the place of God in our life, anything that becomes more important than him, is an idol. I sat down to watch Bristol against Bath yesterday afternoon. That's with a different shaped ball. On Sky at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. Yesterday morning, we were pushing our grandchildren round Cheddar. And at the bottom of Tweentown, which is a road I lived in for the first 18 years of my life, there were Jehovah's Witnesses that have encamped there on a seat with placards and stuff like that. And walked by them. I thought, oh, Lord, I remember when we were in the gorge actually witnessing for Jesus, and now look at them. And it was look at them. Got to the afternoon, as I said, sat down to watch the rugby. And sport, as anybody would know me, is the one that could have been on this list for me. Sat down to watch the rugby, and there'll be some football on later as well. Can't play tennis at the moment because I've hurt myself. But I turned it off, drove to Cheddar, and prayed that they will be still there. And if they're not there, Lord, after what I'm preaching on tomorrow, I'm going to sit on the seat where they were this morning and ask that those 3, in their suits and ties, black ties, were sitting on that seat saying the answer is in what we have, when actually the answer is in Jesus. They weren't there. I sat on that seat and prayed for them, that somehow they would come to know Jesus Christ. Otherwise, all this talk for these people online or for me standing up speaking is just a load of twaddle. Let me reiterate, this isn't a list of things to avoid. or a list we should use to beat ourselves down, or ammunition to shoot at others. This is a list of things that can take the place of God in our lives. When a good thing becomes an ultimate thing, ultimately it becomes a destructive thing in our lives. What we should do with this list is use it to prayerfully evaluate our lives to make sure nothing has become more important to us than God. Where do I spend my time? Where do I spend my money? Where do I get my joy? What's always on my mind? Actually think about those questions. They'll lead you to what either is an idol or what you might be tempted to make an idol. Don't let anything, even a good thing, and many of these things are in themselves good, take the place of God in your life. Now I've got to find my just closing piece of paper. This really is, yes. The last point, very briefly. No king, everyone doing what was right in their own eyes. Moses and Joshua, leaders long gone now. I tried this bit of wordplay in the first service and people sat there and didn't get it. And I wanted to repeat it a few times, but I thought that is just so ignorant, so I won't. Looking forward from those times, Saul, David, and Solomon on the horizon. Saul, the point is they're not perfect either. These three, far from perfect. Saul, sharp and cutting. That's Saul. Solomon never smiled at anyone. David, and this isn't wordplay, David, who wrote a lot of the Psalms and is lifted up as somebody who is a God man, if ever there was one. David's a murderer. You ask Bathsheba what happened. David, a murderer. But a king was coming, and a kingdom is coming where God will explode onto planet Earth. Jesus, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. On your knees, humans, whatever your religion or lack of it, whatever your nationality, on your knees, worship him. Amen.